Thanks, Anne. I told Anne last night that I'm going to do this mini skirt length. I know that's not politically correct, but just long enough to cover the subject and short enough to be interesting. So, a lot louder. Okay, can everybody hear me? So, not really. How about this? Better? I'll lean in a little bit. So I want you to think about the spectrum of human experience and the spectrum of feelings that come up for you during all kinds of things that happen. So over here we have euphoria, we have joy, we have happiness, contentment, discomfort, and then we get into the range of uncomfortable, barely bearable. And then you hit this line, and when you cross it, you get into the unbearable. And I think a lot of people in this room know what that feels like. This feeling is unbearable. I can't tolerate it. How am I going to stand it? And then somehow you reset that boundary and you push it back a little bit, and what was unbearable becomes barely bearable. What was barely bearable maybe becomes acceptable. What was acceptable becomes not so bad. And that's one of the goals of psychotherapy. It's also one of the goals, I think, that spiritual practice has, mindfulness-based practice, like we heard from the yoga teacher yesterday. And I think what people wanted to hear about are what are the things that I can do, what are the things I can add to my life to push that line back and make what feels unbearable more bearable. I know with my mother's illness, it seemed to constantly change. For her, using a walker, the idea of using a walker at one point was unbearable. She just couldn't even talk about it. All of a sudden she's using a walker, and there's a whole other set of issues that are now in the unbearable category. One of the things I want to ask people to do is, if there's something that's really helped you to move from something being unbearable to something bearable, whether it's a conversation with a rabbi or a priest, a conversation with a psychiatric professional, participating in an activity maybe that has nothing to do with FSHD, if you could write it on the card, and somebody's going to help me collect them, and I may just have time to read 2 or 3, but if I can collect them and bring them home, I can put them all together, and maybe everyone's voice can be heard. So, okay. So what helps? We've heard a lot of things here. Social support networks, friends. There's a phrase that a lot of parenting handbooks quote. I think it was from Barry Brazelton, never worry alone. And I think that's a good thing for everybody to remember. We know in the medical literature that people who have some kind of spiritual life, some kind of religious practice, tend to do better than people who don't. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to find religion, but having some kind of spiritual practice can really help. The mindfulness-based practices don't have to mean yoga, it can mean meditation. In my practice, in my psychotherapy practice, I often make what yoga teachers call yoga nidra tapes, or it's a self-hypnosis tape with the patient in my office, where we'll record a relaxation exercise or a breathing exercise right into their iPhone, and then they can take it home and practice with it. and have a voice to guide them through calming themselves down. How do you know when you need professional help? I just want to go through what the symptoms of depression are so that people are aware. There are certain times where it helps to at least consult with a professional. The signs of depression, other than just knowing you feel down, can be sleep interruption, trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or early morning wakening, which overlaps with a lot of the problems of the disease. Trouble taking pleasure in things. It's what we call anhedonia, but a feeling that food just doesn't taste good to me. I can't laugh at people's jokes. I'm not taking pleasure in my children or grandchildren. I just have no zest for life. Guilty ruminations, feeling like I'm doing things wrong, I'm letting people down. Low energy, which again it's a symptom of depression, but it's also a symptom of FSHD, so it's hard to tease that apart. Poor concentration, decreased appetite, feeling agitated, like you can't stop shaking or wringing your hands, or feeling particularly slowed down. Again, that's overlaps with symptom of the disease. And then most important of all is the feeling that life's not worth living anymore, feeling that I'd be better off dead. If you find that you have several of those symptoms that I just mentioned, it would be really important to go and talk to a professional. And it's important to find the right person. So a couple people on the panel earlier this morning were talking about going to a doctor who said, you're making this up, you've got to stop, or we might call them doctors who are not FSHD literate. So you want to find a psychiatrist or a therapist who, if it either understands the disease, has some experience with it, or is willing to read the literature and is really curious and wants to find out as much as they can. You want to have a sense that they get it. And if you don't have that sense, that's a good indication that you should go someplace else. You want to look for a psychiatrist who's an MD if your depression is so severe that you feel medication would be helpful to you. If that's not the case, then you may look for a psychotherapist who's a psychologist or a social worker, and their training tends to be somewhat different and more helpful for certain things. For example, if you want someone to work with your whole family, if you feel the family's in crisis or you think the family needs support, a trained licensed social worker might be the person to go to. If you're having problems with a lot of negative thoughts that are getting in your way and keeping you from moving on and doing productive things with your life, you might want to go to a therapist, a psychologist who's trained in cognitive and behavioral therapy. And what that is, it's a type of therapy where your negative thoughts are isolated. You might write them down, and the therapist will help you to figure out when they're coming up, why they're coming up, and to replace them with more constructive, positive thoughts. There's also anxiety and panic and fear, which I think is a lot of what happens when you get close to that unbearable state. I think with my mother, fear was her biggest problem. And sometimes having somebody to talk to who's outside of the family, you don't feel guilty telling your worst fears to, who's your own private person, is a very helpful thing. And again, I want to say that this doesn't have to be a mental health professional. It could be a clergy person It could be a spiritual advisor of some kind. So I'm just going to read some of the things that people wrote. Every day I make me time. I listen to music. I take a walk. I sit and breathe in silence. One of the things that I really like that listening to music can be incredibly soothing and tap into the emotional part of your brain. You can make a playlist for particular moods. A playlist that's upbeat with your favorite dance songs when you're feeling logy and down. You can make a playlist that's got lullabies when you're feeling afraid or nervous. Smells are also very comforting. So I like to bake Toll House cookies when my kids feel down. I think just having the smell in the house. I also ask patients to create rituals. When I married my husband, he's a very religious Jew. I was born Jewish, but not observant. And he got me into the habit of observing the Sabbath. And so every Friday night, we'd light candles. We have a challah bread. He says the blessings. And I didn't realize how wonderful that would be for me. But it's been just a wonderful thing. By Thursday, I'm thinking, thank God, Friday night's coming. Somebody wrote, asking a stranger for help lets me know that most all people want to be helpful and are good at heart. That's a nice one to think about. Someone else wrote, my faith. Meditation, a study group for learning Buddha teachings. Somebody wrote that losing her mother and realizing that she's now closer to God, everything is better. I think that's an example, again, of faith being helpful. Somebody else wrote, equipment. First, I rent and use it on vacation where no one knows me. That's a good idea. Second, when I purchase the equipment, I use it part-time and make friends with it. Third, I now wonder what in the world I was thinking because I can't live without it. I love that. So that's an example of resilience. Here's somebody who obviously feels a little bit afraid, a little bit concerned, what's it going to be like to be out there with my walker or whatever it is, and has found some really wonderful strategies to make friends with it. Mindfulness, I can't read the word here, but individual and group psychotherapy. I think support groups can be a wonderful thing. And even if you just find one kindred soul among the support group, that's a wonderful thing. Last night at the board meeting, at the end of the meal, we were getting up to go, and I heard one member say to the other, so how do you get up? Do you go to the right or do you go to the left? And she said, well, I go to the right and then I stick my butt way out. And I thought, God, if only my mother could have been at this table, because she would have felt like she was with kindred souls and, who really understood what goes on in your head about how do I get up. Somebody wrote, every day I laugh. A funny video on YouTube. I rent comedy videos. I call a friend who thinks outside the box. Okay. Make a friend with somebody funny. Write what you can't say out loud until you have written it enough to say it out loud. These are really wonderful things. So I'm not going to, I think, go on any longer, but just I want to draw your attention to a resource handout that I put in your folders, of just some very helpful books. When Bad Things Happen to Good People, some of you may know this one. It's written by a rabbi who's lost his son to a degenerative disease. The Places That Scare You, A Guide to Fearlessness in Difficult Times by Pema Chodron, who's a Buddhist nun and writes very thoughtfully about how to deal with that really hard place where you feel terrified. Care of the Soul, A Guide for Cultivating Depth and Sacredness in Everyday Life by Thomas More, who was a former Catholic monk. And then Tuesdays with Morrie, An Old Man, a Young Man, and Life's Greatest Lesson, which is a lovely story that I think was made into a movie, probably a lot of you know. If you have other resources that you love, write them down, pass them to me before I leave, and we'll make sure that they get in the next resource list for the next meeting. Thanks, and I'm going to let Anne come back up.